continue. All right, please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be made available on the Orcas Senior Center website, and it may also be posted to social media for promotional and or educational purposes. So welcome to all of you who have navigated our registration process. I'm John Slater with Orcas Senior Center, and this is our 7th scheduled presentation of the 2021 season of Meeting of the Minds on Zoom. Today's presentation is Cascade Creek Coho Salmon and Water Restoration. It was incorrectly identified on our website until yesterday afternoon as Forage Fishes and the Beach, the role of local shorelines in marine ecosystem recovery. That presentation will actually be taking place in May, so I do apologize to any of you who are here expecting that talk, but I'm sure you'll find today's presentation equally as interesting and important, and I hope you'll stay with us. Before I get started, I'm just going to go over some Zoom features. Right now, you're all on mute. You'll find the microphone icon on the lower left of your screen that says unmute below it. You'll notice that if you click on it, you'll see it says the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. This is to prevent interface during the presentation. After the presentation, I will change the setting to allow you to use this microphone icon to unmute yourselves and ask questions. Next to the microphone icon, you will see the video start/stop icon. Clicking on it allows you to either be seen or not seen. You may choose whichever is comfortable for you. And again, you can toggle back and forth between stop and start using that same icon, which just renames itself. And then finally, at the top right of your screen, you'll find the view icon, which allows you to change how people are displayed on your screen. So you may choose either gallery view or speaker view. Gallery view shows everyone, speaker view just shows who is speaking. So I recommend that one. And now let's get on with the show. Our presenter today is Jenny DeGroot. Jenny holds a master's degree in science from the University of British Columbia. And prior to making her home in the San Juan Islands, she studied sea otters, harbor seals, Weddell seals, and cutthroat trout in projects in British Columbia, Alaska, and Antarctica. And Jenny is currently fisheries consultant and owner of Speckled Trout Consulting. And today, Jenny is going to tell us about the only known species of salmon to spawn naturally right here in the San Juan Islands, and that's the Coho salmon. So with that, I will turn it over to Jenny. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart.
It's our pleasure.
Yes, near and dear is Cascade Creek Coho Salmon. And I've been a fisheries consultant for the San Juan County Land Bank now for the past 4 years. And I'd like to share with you what I've actually learned about Cascade Creek Coho, what challenges they face, and where we are now on trying to protect them. And I'll also make a disclaimer here that I'm not speaking from the perspective of the land bank, that I'm really speaking on my own personal experience. And there's also gaps in my knowledge. So I'd really love to learn more from many of you if you have more information about the Coho salmon here or any other wild fish in our watersheds. And I see a lot of familiar faces there, but I am curious as to how many of you actually know that we have a wild salmon run here in the San Juan Islands. Show of hands, maybe? Yeah, good. I see some hands. That's perfect. Yeah, so when I mean wild, I actually mean not a hatchery run. It's actually the salmon come back naturally in the creek and they spawn naturally in the creek. And I certainly didn't know that there was a salmon run here until I moved to the San Juan Islands a good 10 years ago. And we were collecting coastal cutthroat trout information in the stream, and we caught 35 coho fry at that time. And so later on, I checked the state salmon stock inventory, and I found that coho salmon are a stock of unknown origin with wild production, and that there had been no genetic information on these coho. And I'm sure that a lot of islanders knew they were there, and I know the state knew they were there, but from the perspective of studies that were done or any monitoring that hadn't actually been done beyond identifying them being present in the creek. And I even remember calling the state at the time and asking them if they were ever planning on doing it. And they said that the run is too small and it really didn't have much of a commercial value. But salmon basically have been here. They were here a lot earlier. Back in the 1800s to the early 1920s, there were a lot of fish traps that were out here in the Salish Sea along the shoreline. And there's a picture that I put here of Caillou Lagoon out near Deer Harbor. And this was an ancient way of fishing for a lot of the First Nation people. And it consisted of a lead line that ran along the shoreline. It had pilings that would go and collect all the fish that were migrating along the shoreline. It would bring them out to deeper water, and there they would be put in a fish trap where they'd be collected. And I found this photo from our Washington Rural Heritage Collection, which you can actually access on Orcas Island Public Library. It was taken in 1929, and it says here that with the photo, Henry Caillou, he owned this trap, and he was considered at the time one of the best fishermen along the San Juan Islands. He had fish traps out near Güemes Island, off the salmon bank at San Juan Island, as well as Orcas Island, and probably others that I'm really not aware of. I found another photo. This is actually a closer shot of some of the salmon being brought back in 1929 here. You can see a group of men that are working the salmon trap, and they're pulling out all the fish and bringing it out as the tender is waiting alongside. And there actually was a cannery in Deer Harbor, so I'm sure they didn't have to go too far. It's this photo is entitled, it says, Caillou's Fish Trap on Orcas Island. It says, Henry's Caillou Fish Trap. It goes on to say, Henry Caillou was the owner of the first fish trap in Washington. I don't know. He is rumored to have caught more than 5 million salmon in his lifetime. And he credits his uncle, Lummi Chief Weddell, with teaching him everything he knows about fishing. And these traps were actually so efficient that the state actually banned them in 1934. But it's pretty interesting to note that they might be making a comeback because some of the native First Nation people up in Canada have used some of these. And I know Wild Fish Conservancy is doing a research project out on the Columbia River where they're looking at setting up fish traps because they're an efficient way of collecting fish and identifying species that are endangered and releasing those and being able to get their target species. So it's a pretty interesting old way of collecting fish, but I think it's fair and important to say that salmon still have commercial, subsistence, and ceremonial value to many of our First Nations people here in the Salish Sea, and they have since time immemorial, regardless of what way in which manner in which they fished. Because I think you probably want to see more pictures. I've got some more here. And salmon have always been an important part of our sport fishery here in the San Juan Islands. So I put these other pictures out here to show you some of them. And if you see on the left, there's Betty and Mary Bolton on the left-hand side with their catch in 1930. They lived at the Mountain Lake Cabin at Moran State Park. And they have definitely Chinook and potentially Coho salmon on their line. But I love this photo because it shows their dog Trixie, who seems to be posing for the photo. It looks like Trixie knew how to do that and has probably been there for a lot of those photos. And if you look on to the right, you'll see that there's a photo of some of the visitors from the lodge that it was out near Doe Bay with their catch. And as you can see, there's another shot of a dog there that seems a lot less interested. And salmon sport fishing is still a big draw to the islands, but today our whale watching tours probably draw more of our visitors. Which brings me to our endangered southern resident killer whales and their essential need for a lot of salmon. And islanders celebrate each orca calf like we do in the spring. that's born, and we mourn the loss of those, just like we, the rest of the nation, did when Tallulah carried her dead calf for 17 days in the Sailor's Sea. Most of us islanders know that southern resident killer whales need salmon, and less salmon means less orcas. And although southern resident killer whales predominantly eat Chinook salmon in their summer months, they also are known to feed on steelhead and coho salmon when the Chinook aren't running. And all of these stocks of salmon are in decline, which doesn't look good, obviously, for our orcas. And it seems logical that any increase in any of these salmon stocks would certainly benefit these endangered orcas. But along with us, there's certainly a lot of consumers of salmon. And I've shown a couple pictures of them here. There's certainly eagles and bears and other seabirds, like the one on the right here, who is consuming this carcass, and American dippers, which we see on the left. And American dippers we see in Cascade Creek quite a bit, and they're known to actually eat a lot of salmon eggs. But they've been documented to have at least 130 species of animals that actually depend in one way or another on salmon and the returning salmon. And that's why salmon have been considered a keystone species that influence their survival and the reproduction of many other species. And finally, just because I need to, salmon do transform their natal streams into more productive ones. And when you think of watersheds in this region, you pretty much think of everything within a watershed drains, like the water, all of the large woody debris, all of the nutrients, it all flows back into the ocean. And salmon are one of the only species that actually return nutrients back to their ecosystem. And when they return, they eventually die. They'll leave their carcasses there that literally pump nutrients back into the stream beds and the surrounding forests. And when I was a graduate student, I remember a study that was pretty amazing to me. UW researchers tracked the marine-derived nitrogen in forests with salmon in it from those without. And they found that not only were the trees taking up a lot of marine-derived nitrogen, they were actually growing bigger. And here's the cool thing, is that bigger trees eventually fall into the creek, and that helps to build better in-stream habitat for future salmon generations. So ecologically, spawning salmon leave a better home for their future progeny, which I think is really interesting. Okay, but what about coho salmon, you're probably asking? Well, if you don't know much about the different salmon, they're actually called silver salmon, and they're much smaller than Chinook. They tend to grow about 7 to 11 pounds. They're distinguished from lighter spotting, and they have a black mouth with white gums. Their spotting doesn't extend all the way down to their tail, and they are declining like Chinook salmon and steelhead in the Sailor's Sea. And that might be because coho salmon have pretty sensitive life stages for Pacific salmon. They have a 3-year life cycle, which includes half of their life in freshwater and half of their life in saltwater. And being in a creek can be very challenging, and probably even more so in creeks like we have out here. So when coho salmon come back to their natal streams, that's in November here at Cascade Creek. And usually that's after the first heavy rainfall. They move upstream and they build their nests or their redds in specific areas in the creek where the substrate's not too silty nor too coarse to smother their eggs, and where they have just the right amount of flow for those eggs to overwinter in the creek. They also have pretty amazing homing behavior, which we've seen, that a single female came up in the creek and she spawned at the exact same location in 1 year then, and as her progeny would have the next time they came back up. And it even was to almost the exact calendar date. And if you look at this photo here, you'll see that it is a female and a male, and the female, she has started to build her redd. She's excavated a lot of the area around there and kind of cleared the area of silt. What will happen is that the male will come up and he will be alongside her. She will have built her redd and she will drop some of her eggs and he will fertilize it, and then she will turn off on her side and she will cover that redd back up again. She'll often go up in the creek and do that a couple more times because she doesn't want to put all of her eggs in one basket, basically. And once they're in the ocean, it's, let's see, we'll go. Now we're at this stage. Okay, the eggs will develop over the winter, as I mentioned, until they're old enough to eye out of the egg, and then they'll consume their egg sac, and then they'll swim up in the creek and take residence in the creek. And here they'll obviously have lots of challenges like American dippers that might eat them, or maybe the spring storms might actually wash some of these alevin down the stream. They emerge in April in Cascade Creek, and they'll rear in the creek for a full year if they aren't preyed on by other animals like the American dipper. I'm giving them a hard time though, I think. Or if they get pushed out with flooding conditions, or in the summer when they actually can dry up in the creek. And then they'll go through some physiological stages where they'll actually smolt out and go back to the ocean. And once they're in the ocean, it's thought that they don't migrate too far away from the Sailor Sea. They'll get bigger and with more food availability. And if they don't get eaten, they'll hopefully come back and spawn. Man-made barriers aren't much of a problem for coho salmon anymore at Cascade Creek, thanks to San Juan County's public works and salmon recovery funds that rebuilt the old undersized culvert, which you see at Cascade Creek here on the left. It's made it much easier for salmon to move upstream into their spawning beds if they have enough stream flow to do so. And coho in and around Seattle have been making the news lately, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware. They're coming back to their natal streams, bright and healthy, but unfortunately they're dying before they spawn. And researchers are linking these die-offs to a lethal cocktail of stormwater from road runoff, and in particular, a preservative that's used in manufacturing tires. And although the county hasn't sampled for this compound in particular, previous water quality studies in the county have found that water in this watershed is fairly clean. And thanks in large part to the protection of the upper watershed, which is at Mountain Lake in Moran State Park, as well as other protections farther down in the watershed at Coho Preserve and the San Juan Islands Preservation Trust, which is farther down at Buck Bay. So you can see Mountain Lake here in this green box at the top. That's the top of the watershed, and down at the bottom, you'll see that that's Buck Bay, and above it would be Coho Preserve. And many of you probably have even walked over to the Cascade Falls at Moran State Park and seen it there. That's a huge tourist attraction, and I'm sure that you'd agree with me that that has beautiful, clean water. And honestly, I probably should say it's also probably thanks in large part to a lot of the islanders that have really maintained a lot of large forested areas along the riparian corridor all the way down the watershed. So keeping intact large trees with overhanging canopy helps to ensure that the water temperatures in the creek stay cool and clean for salmon like coho to survive. And in my opinion, one of the best things we've been able to accomplish for salmon recently in Cascade Creek is to acquire Coho Preserve with state salmon recovery funds and our land bank's local real estate excise tax. 24 acres were protected, including a large section of the creek for wild fish and for future generations to explore. And if you haven't done so already, you really need to visit Coho Preserve. I feel like I'm giving a plug, but it's true. Just make sure to stay on the trails and remember that fishing isn't allowed, since these fish populations here are quite small and it would be very easy to fish them out, which would be a shame. And if you go to the preserve, you may also see us doing some work in the creek. And one of the things we monitor at the creek is the number of coho coming back to spawn. We use direct observations from weekly to almost daily visits during spawning season. Or we'll use a GoPro on a pole, like you see in this photo here in the upper right, to get a better estimate for the number of fish in deeper pools. And I started monitoring the creek in 2015 as a volunteer for the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement. And I'll include this run here first in this bar graph, which included 5 adults that came up to spawn. We counted 9 individuals in 2016, as you see from the bar graph again, and unfortunately we only observed 2 in 2019. And in 2017, 2018, and 2020, we didn't see any coho salmon adults returning. I'm gonna put that on pause a second there. Okay, all right. Hold on a second here. Okay. Coho salmon are sensitive to disturbance at or near their spawning beds. And in 2015, the county emergency realignment of the creek at Point Lawrence Bridge probably spooked the returning adults, since we didn't see them that fall after that event. County crew counted 5 coho adults in freshwater in the creek. And they took this video that I'll show you of a pair moving back to salt water. And you can hear the excavators in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and show it and see what they look like. Let's see if it works. All right, well, one chum salmon was filmed that year upstream the day later, but as I mentioned, the coho salmon were not reported to be there the whole month after. And so we pretty much lost that 2015 run because we didn't sample coho fry the following year. And we were able to confirm that in 2018, since again, they have a 3-year life cycle, and what we lost in 2015 should have come back in 2018, and we did not see them. Let's see, I've got the line there, as you see. All right, in 2016, we were able to document 9 adult spawners that came back in the full spawning event in Cascade Creek, which the first entry of a salmon that came in the creek was November 8th, and the final observation of salmon was November 18th. And so we reported all this information to the state, which was a nice thing to do. And we also gave, I must give Land Bank volunteer Jerry Weatherman a lot of credit, because he came out almost daily during this year to document the salmon. And he took this video that I'll show you, and hopefully you'll see the male and female swimming together. And then you'll see the female turning on her side to excavate the red. Oops. And in 2017, we didn't see any adult spawners. So it wasn't a surprise that we didn't see any in 2020. We also didn't see any in 2018, which we already discussed. And in 2019, we expected to see adults returning because we'd had a successful spawn in 2016. One coho female entered the freshwater on November 18th and started to build her nests. So I'll show that video here. We have lots of those videos. And later, we saw another coho in the creek. After this first female, it came up to the creek and we saw the two together, but the initial female that was building reds, she chased this other salmon down the stream, and then we never saw it again. And given the behavior of the pair that we saw, we assumed it was a territorial female that was pushing another female off her red. And that's pretty common with salmon. And the only, honestly, the only consolation at that time that I felt at the end of the year, having only seen one actually build a red and not seeing any pairs actually successfully spawn or look like they did, was that we had Samish elder Rosie Caillou come out to the mouth of the creek and make a welcoming prayer for the salmon. So I thought that was very special. It made me feel very good because I honestly thought we lost that run. Oops. Okay, but on April 14th, we observed salmon fry that had just emerged in Cascade Creek, which was honestly unbelievable. I was completely surprised about that even having happened, given what we had known about the salmon the previous year. And I am just going to point out that we have this photarium. My husband said, you have to tell people about those photariums because nobody knows. But most of the fish that we get, we put them in photariums just to take their photo. And it's a really nice thing to do instead of handling them. And if any of you are fly fishermen or you like to do catch and release, this is really the way to go. So we also do seine surveys annually to see what's in the preserve. We use a seine net with 2 poles on the end, as you can see from the photo here, with a heavier line on the bottom and a float line on the top. So we move up in the creek and we purse the net up in more of a shallow area upstream, and we collect all the fish and we measure them all for their fork lengths, and we obviously count them, and then we release them back in the creek. And seine netting is actually a pretty good way to get an estimate of the numbers in the creek. You're obviously going to lose some, but it will give you a pretty conservative estimate. And it will give you obviously the size. And if you've got multi-aged class fish in there, it'll give you a pretty good idea of their ages as well. And seining is a less harmful way to handle fish than other techniques like electrofishing might be in small streams like this. So we caught 228 coho fry in 2017, the first green bar on the chart, and 177, the blue bar, in 2020. You'll remember that we didn't have coho in the creek every year, so we didn't find any in all of our seine nets in 2016, 2018, and 2019. We also sampled once again in November of 2017 and caught 100 fry, which is the second smaller bar. And I'll explain that later, which was more than a 50% drop from its earlier seine in July. But we also monitor the other fish in the creek, including coastal cutthroat trout in the upper right-hand photo. And many of these fish are probably sea-run cutthroat, which means that they have both a saltwater and a freshwater life stage like other anadromous salmon. They're certainly beautiful fish, and these fish have been recorded in the creek since the early 1900s. We also survey for the freshwater sculpins. Here you will see it alongside a smaller coho fry at the bottom of the screen. We often get reticulated and staghorn sculpins. I'm certainly not an expert on this. Russell Barsh has been doing a lot of work, and in the past we've collected some of the fin clips for him to do genetic analyses on it. We also have invasive brook trout, which you can see here on the left, and we monitor them because they can be very damaging for the fish that are in the creek. Because not only could they potentially prey on them, but they also outcompete for a lot of the habitat in some of these creeks. And more often than not, invasive species like brook trout and other bass, other fish like this that have been stocked actually can be very harmful for a lot of our native fish here. So if you don't know what's in your watershed, please ask someone. Certainly somebody from either myself, Russell Barsh, Wild Fish Conservancy. There's a lot of people on the island that are very knowledgeable about it. So please ask before you stock. And besides cold, clean, oxygenated water, coho salmon need year-round access to different rearing areas in the creek, depending on their age and the stream conditions. So smaller coho fry will emerge and they will be in warmer, more shallower waters in the creek. And as they get older, they'll move to deeper pools that are cooler and also probably areas where they're not going to be preyed on. So finding cool, deep pools can obviously be problematic here in the San Juans because most of our stream flow comes not from mountains like a lot of our streams like the Skagit and other larger watersheds will get. Most of our stream flow comes from precipitation versus snow melt. And I think that obviously it's going to become more problematic as our climate gets warmer here as projected, as well as increased pressure from water users as we increase our development pressure here on the islands. We usually get total discharge readings, which you can see here Jerry is doing. We get velocity readings with a flow meter, and we also get depth readings along the channel, the creek, and with that we get total discharge readings. We do this monthly, and sometimes we do spot checks depending on if there's enough of a condition in the summer that it's quite dry. We'll go out more frequently. And in 2017, we observed 3 days with zero flows. I have a photo of them here. These are 3 photos that show 3 places within Cascade Creek. The photo on the upper right-hand corner is taken directly above the Point Lawrence Bridge, which many of you are probably aware of. The others are farther up in the watershed, which you might have not seen. This dewatering event occurred over 2 full days, and coho salmon fry in the creek were supposed to overwinter before they moved to the ocean in the spring. And a dewatering event like this can be devastating for fish since they're often trapped in the creek with little water. And if they don't die directly from lack of water, they may be more susceptible to predators, deoxygenation in the water, and exposure to water temperatures that are considered lethal. And if you remember the earlier numbers of fish that we caught from seines, we also took a November seine effort. And with that, we lost 50% of our coho. That was taken right after this dewatering event, a couple weeks after actually. So we did lose a fair amount. So what do you do when you see a dewatering event like this? You'll call the state, and in this case, the Department of Ecology, who contacts the Washington parks to release more water from Mountain Lake and on through to the creeks. And that's based on our state laws. Sadly, though, it took 2 full days for the creek to start flowing again. And although it's not the norm, it points out how essential it is to monitor stream flows in creeks like this for our fish stocks. But you'll be happy to know that the land bank is planning on installing a remote data logger in Cascade Creek that will act as an early warning system if the water ever gets to a critical level. And this was funded in part by the San Juan County's Clean Water Utility Funds. And it was approved and it should be installed relatively soon. Okay, fish need water, but actually how much water do they need? And in 2018, we worked with Steve Basso with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and on an in-stream flow study to answer that question. We collected stream flow measurements shown here on the left and information on the stream morphology, which you can see here on the right, over 3 separate hydrologic cycles. So we started at a very low flow and then we sampled it as there was more water in the creek. These stream conditions were then modeled over varying stream flows in what was called a physical habitat simulation model. I'm not an expert on it, but I'll just show you a little bit about it. What it ultimately gives you is a simulation of a weighted suitability curve here shown on the y-axis over various flow conditions shown here on the x-axis. So for coho salmon, which is the pink line here, let's see, the pink line here, you can see that the lower range of spawning suitability is roughly 1 cubic foot of water per second. You can see this shown here within the red circle. 1 CFS is equivalent to about 8 gallons of water per second, often more than fish experience in a dry November when they're coming back to spawn. So why can't the park just send more water for salmon from Mountain Lake? There should be more than enough water in Mountain Lake to do so. Because we're only talking about 1 CFS of water. Should be easy, right? Well, it's more complicated than that. Washington water laws are set up with the idea of prioritization, first in time, first in right. And in the old days, you could stake out your claim by literally using it. That's probably what the Cascade Lumber Company, shown on the photo on the left here, did in the 1880s out at Cascade Bay. They milled their lumber here mostly for making barrels for the lime kilns. They diverted the water from Cascade Creek to Cascade Lake, which is not its natural course, natural drainage, and on into Cascade Bay. And if you look closely and you know enough about Rosario, you probably can see where the Rosario Marina is from this photo. Then along came Robert Moran, who purchased the mill, the land around it, and the water rights to the mill. And over time, he develops a hydroelectric dam that supplies DC power to the mansion and the grounds around the mansion. So based on first in time, first in right, Robert Moran and future owners of the Rosario Mansion have the first and the senior-most water right, which was established in 1884 with the mill. Water rights can be pretty complicated, so I'll really try to show you about all the water users here. Water is diverted from Cascade Creek on the southern end of the park, if you know where that is on your way out, and shown here in the red. The pipe on the bottom of this diversion wall takes water overland to the Cascade Lake through a concrete channel, where it then moves on to Rosario to be used for hydroelectric power. Olga's point of diversion, shown in the yellow here with a priority date of 1908, is taken out above the southern park entrance. And Dobey's point of diversion is in Mountain Lake and shown here in green with a priority date of 1945. And finally, in the blue, water is held in trust through a negotiation with the previous Rosario owners that is 1 second junior to Rosario's senior right, shown here as 1884 plus 1 second. All right, for review, okay, coho salmon don't have water rights in November. And in a dry year like the one that we had in 2019, there's not even enough stream flow for them to move up to their spawning beds. And what do we do knowing that? What can we do knowing that they're coming back up? We did what we could do, which was with the help of the Orcas Women's Coalition, we politely asked the owners of Rosario to keep more water in the creek for salmon. And thankfully, they agreed to do so voluntarily, and they were even interested enough to send us an email saying, "Go Team Coho." And salmon, as you know, were able to spawn that year, so that was wonderful. The problem here is twofold, in that it depends on the goodwill of the current water owner, which may or may not be the same person from year to year, and it also doesn't compensate the water owner for the use of their water that could have gone to hydroelectric production. So what can be done here? Well, we could set aside water in trust for salmon through a negotiation, which is essentially banking this water. Water banks exist in most Western states and are administered in Washington through the state's Trust Water Right program. And it says that the Department of Ecology can hold water rights in trust for the benefit of other users like salmon. You just need a willing seller or lender and a buyer or loanee. Cascade Creek previously established a trust water right in 2008 with the previous owner of Rosario and negotiated it through the nonprofit Washington Water Trust. The problem was that the water put in trust in 2008 was too little given our current understanding for the needs of coho salmon in the creek and their spawning time, since they don't get any water in November. And there were other changes in the system. An example would be the diversion channel in the park was upgraded, which is actually now much more efficient, and it takes more water out of the creek. The assumption here has always been that we would always have rainy Novembers and there'd be more than enough water in the creek for salmon, but we're finding that this didn't happen in 2019. It probably might not happen into the future with warmer climate projections. Water banking is probably our best hope for protecting this last salmon run in the San Juan Islands. And there are still things that we can do to protect coho salmon, like plant trees along the riparian corridor, which the land bank has recently done. And we can also improve salmon habitat for Cascade Creek. But I would argue at the end of the day, salmon and wild fish just need water, and this creek certainly needs more water protection. There is enough water in this watershed to support salmon, and it hasn't been easy for them. Believe me, I've watched a female build redds in the creek without a mate for a good full week. It's heartbreaking, but she never gave up. And I hope that we don't give up on them either. Let's leave at least one wild salmon run left in the San Juan Islands. Thank you. And with that, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you, Jenny. I've allowed people to unmute themselves. We just have about a little less than 10 minutes to get some questions. So who would like to talk here? Let's see.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was a really wonderful, beautiful presentation, and thanks for all your hard work on Cascade Creek. It's really made a difference. I have a question about the year classes that were lost. I guess it was what, 17 and 18?
Yeah, 15 and 2018. And then we just didn't see some of the other year classes in 2017. So yes.
So my question is, I'm wondering if we've lost those cohorts of salmon, what's your thoughts about other salmon that might stray in and use Cascade Creek, because it's so intermittent, we don't get a continuity year after year?
Well, you know, coho are known to stray. In fact, I was just reading a really interesting paper about nomad coho. They can actually, their life history would be that they actually can stray and go to these other creeks and reestablish themselves. But unfortunately, we don't really have the parent populations nearby to come and repopulate them. So if we had healthier salmon stocks throughout the islands, you know, I wouldn't doubt that this would happen. But again, where would they come from? That's my only concern.
Jenny?
Does that answer your question, Kim?
Yeah, I guess we're just kind of hoping that other cohos will find their way into Cascade Creek and that we can get the water sustained in there year after year so we could actually build a sustainable run there.
Yeah, and I mean, there has been discussion about potentially restoring or trying to rebuild a population in those years that we know that we lost them, like the 2015, 2018. But that's really challenging if we don't have the water for them to survive and prosper in those creeks. So again, I think we have to get all the parts and pieces in there before we decide to start, trying to restore some of those lost runs.
Once we have the water, we do have an incubator down the stream, and the Fish and Wildlife will provide us with eggs from some other place that can help restore the run. But of course, we need the water first.
Yeah, that's right. And Sandy, I just will probably introduce you to everyone. Sandy, you're a property owner down there, so you've actually seen this creek for many years. And I know that you had chum in some of the incubators down there.
We had some natural coho. There's some video posted on the web.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful run when it's there. I hope we get.
It is a beautiful run. It would be great to restore some of those lost years. But we certainly need to protect the one we have now.
Jenny, could you explain about the water rights? What happens if there isn't enough for the hydro?
So, I mean, obviously there is ways of negotiating for water if there's willing sellers of some of their water. And in fact, the land bank has 2 grants that they recently got that would allow the state to pay a willing water owner to sell some of their water. So again, I think we're in the process of maybe having negotiations with some of these water holders to see if they're interested in banking some of this water.
I hope if they do get banked, that we ask them for a contract for more senior rights, or portion of their senior right, rather than something that's still a 1-minute subordinate.
Yeah. And I'm just going to admit, I don't know that, water law is not my thing. This is just really where we are right now. And, as far as I understand, we're in negotiations. We'd like to see that happen if we have a willing water seller. Honestly, wherever it comes, it'll be great for them.
Yeah, one of the concerns I have is Buck Smith from the Department of Ecology in the newspaper article misstated that the water right guarantees flow, and the subordinate water right does not guarantee a flow. It's only if the water is available, then we get it. So I hope we don't make the same mistake by buying a subordinate water right. A contract would be much more useful.
Yeah. Agreed, Sandy. And I don't know if there's any other questions.
Yeah.
Well, Ken,
Ken?
excuse me
Yeah.
just a moment. We just are running up against the hour, and I just want to give my Orcas Center spiel, and then I'll leave it open to questions if Jenny would like to linger. But Orcas Center would like to thank Jenny for taking her time on her busy schedule. I know she's very busy at the library. Thank you for opening up and sharing all your knowledge about these very precious resource that we have here for our orca whales. And thanks to all of you for joining us, for finding us on Zoom as the Senior Center continues to remain closed due to COVID. If you appreciate Meeting of the Minds and would like to see other presentations like this, would like to support us, we would suggest a donation of $5, and you may donate online or with a personal check. I've put in the chat the Orcas Senior Center address and web address. It's orcasseniors.org or PO Box 1653, and that's in East Sound. Next month, we're going to have Recovered Fruit, Conserving the Island's Ancient Food Forests by Madrona Murphy, and she's with Quiat. And if you'd like to receive a reminder of this presentation the day prior, you can go to the website and pre-register, and you'll get a Zoom-generated reminder the day before. There's no need to register on the day of. And then with that, I will leave it to Jenny if she'd like to continue with questions and answers. And thanks again, Jenny, and thanks again to all of you.
Thank you, John.
You bet.
Ken, I
Yeah.
think you had a question.
Yeah, Jenny.
I'm happy to stay.
I got to look at the right monitor here. Jenny, is there any evidence that the tribes made use of the salmon run in this creek?
I've asked the Samish about that. So I don't know exactly what they have for that. I do know that they've also said that sometimes some of those fish bones don't stay there that long. So I don't know that far back.
I mean, this maybe would
nothing
not have been a big
jumped
run
out.
for them. I mean, compared to some
No.
of the other sources that they had to harvest salmon, this would have been pretty small potatoes.
Sandy.
There is documentation of an Indian village right here at the bay, Buck Bay in Oregon. There was a
'Cause I
village
mean,
here.
in some sense, I mean, if they made use of that run, of that particular source of salmon, I mean, that would make them, I mean, my point of view would make them the most senior water right users. And I know that some of the, or I believe that some of the work that's been done to open up, culverts, rebuild culverts and things like that was done at the impetus to bring back runs which Native Americans have used in the past. So it seems like this is something the state already does a bit, takes that into account. The fact that these were maybe not active runs now, but they were historically runs that the natives would use. And so, I don't know, it just seems to me like it's crazy that, Rosario with 5,000 vacation rentals can suck up all the water throughout the summer, and the fish get zero. It's nuts. Yeah. But that's the big,
Tragic.
it's dollars win every time. So.
Yeah, that's the way our state's laws are, as far as obviously treaty rights are going to end up being federal laws, which states should fall under the federal laws. So, yeah, I won't speak any more to that, but it does seem to me that, yes, probably first in time certainly would probably be coho. And so that's my thought on it. But right now we're negotiating for hopefully getting some more water rights given our state laws.
Look at all those people going into the library behind you.
Yeah, I know. We're busy. If you don't know, we're open Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday from noon till 5.
Okay.
Are there any other? I see Boyd Pratt here though. Boyd, I don't know. I know you're doing a lot of work on the salmon bank out in San Juan Island. You have a lot of information on that. I'm just hoping that I didn't say anything incorrectly.
No, I mean, I have a few minor corrections, but
Yeah.
This is a great presentation. I really, really appreciate your efforts here, Jenny. I'm curious about when the boundary survey came through here in the 1850s, they identified at least 3 major sources of water that had enough head for a sawmill, and Cascade Creek was one of them. I assume the other 2 were probably the one near the UW Labs near Friday Harbor and possibly False Bay. I'm not too sure. Do you have any sense of the salmon runs on those?
Deer Harbor, actually, during that geological study, they actually identified Deer Harbor as having the largest flow, basically the largest stream flow. And to me, it makes sense that if that's exactly where Henry Caillou and his family actually had, not only was there a cannery there, but they had an active fish trap there. I'm assuming that they probably had salmon in Fish Trap Creek. In fact, I would say and argue that probably every year-round flowing creek that was here on the islands probably supported some kind of either coastal cutthroat trout or probably potentially coho at one time.
Oh.
I did collect genetic samples of these fry. I've sent them off to DFW. They are going to be working on a larger statewide genetic study of their coho, so they haven't gotten back to me on that. But I'm just also really interested to know where these coho are, because the assumption is that they were cataloged in the 70s as being a wild run back then, and I'm not aware of anything before that that would have planted these coho here, or chum, as Sandy has said.
I just comment on the sawmills. I think you might want to look at Thatcher on Blakely Island, Boyd.
Okay.
There was a big sawmill in there. Salmon recovery basically restored. They took out all the old sawdust that was on the beach from that big sawmill in Thatcher and restored the beach back to its natural conditions. But there's also a little hydro plant in there that's still operating.
Well, that's really interesting because I ran across historic records of I think it was the Western Mills in West Sound, where the sawdust had clogged up a lot of the fish runs near there and really messed with the fish ecology there. And then I think it was a general complaint throughout the state of Washington that sawdust had really damaged a lot of the fishing ecosystems. So,
Yeah, well, if it's not that alone, it also, I mean, the way that in which they used to log, and I can say that because my grandfather was a logger and he moved out west to Oregon to log all the great forests in Oregon. And he, you know, remembers skidding logs through the creeks. And I remember being a really small girl on his lap, and he would always tell me, you know, Jenny, I remember taking lunch at this one place that was this beautiful creek. And he said, I took my lunch and there was a steelhead that was swimming there in a beautiful pool. And he said, I'm sure if you go back there now, you won't find it. You won't find any more steelhead. So, I mean, I remember him saying that as much as he was proud of what he did, because he actually was also in the CCC, and that's where he learned how to do a lot of logging. He, you know, even into his 90s, he was still felt poorly about that.
So Jenny, I was wondering, have you thought about if we can get this water situation stabilized with a little more in-stream flow and get some certainty that there'll be water there every November? Have you thought about expanding that run above the low falls there? There's a lot of really
Well, the old timers in that area took dynamite and tried to kind of extend that run. I certainly don't think that's anything that we would do nowadays. I do think actually the lower part of the watershed, which is below an anadromous natural cascade, that there's ways of actually improving the in-stream habitat by maybe felling a couple old trees across the channel so that there's different in-stream habitat for fish, because I found that we don't have a lot of wood in that system, and some of the spawning habitat in there is a bit limited.
They just planted about 500 trees down there last week.
Yep, little tiny ones. They're working on it. They're working on it. I think it's great. I mean, you know, honestly, Coho Preserve is an amazing thing. I'm so glad that, you know, that Salmon Recovery was able to acquire that piece for the land bank. It's great.
Yeah, and my side's been planted as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sandy. And that's you too. It's the property owners that have done a great job.
Who is it with the Women's League that's negotiating the water rights?
Orcas Women's Coalition sent a letter to Rosario back in 2019 in the fall, asking them to please keep 0.5 CFS of water in the creek in October and 1 CFS of water in the creek in November. And so the owners...
The Women's League that's talking with them.
Yeah, it's the Orcas Women's Coalition. And because of that letter, they said yes. So I think that was great that year, but you know, and into the future, it'd be nice to have a little bit more secure.
I'm trying to find out the individual, because, you know, I did a lot of study on the water rights laws and looked at Rosario's in great detail. I was president of Local Water for several years, which is also subordinate to Rosario's rights. And in the Yakima Valley, there was a huge lawsuit involving over 1,000 litigants, where domestic water was subordinate to irrigation, and it got ugly. So, you know, I'm concerned about the water rights on behalf of Olga and Dobay. In dry years, they could legally threaten to shut us down, and we'd have to go to the Department of Ecology to get a temporary stay and then negotiate under duress. So it's a concern still.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what's happening in the West right now, unfortunately, as our summers are getting drier and extending longer into the fall. I think this is starting to happen more and more. So it's a challenge. Definitely, there's a limited amount of water. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any.
I wanted to say thank you for a very nice presentation with good photos and history and something other than an academic PowerPoint bullet session. Thank you. My question,
Yes, but thank you.
and for going slowly enough to get that water right aspect easy to understand. Do you coordinate at all or look at the efforts with some of the other streams? We're at the end of the creek that runs into West Beach at the end of Enchanted Forest Road. And
Yes.
there's a public-private partnership that's worked to open up the culverts gradually going upstream. And the Friends of San Juan, they have found some baby salmonids in the last couple years or so. Do you communicate with them at all to compare notes, or is
No,
there?
I don't. I got my master's degree on coastal cutthroat trout. So I did work on a CDOC funded project where we went in to go sample, and have also done some stream water work for the county in West Beach. So I actually did see a small little fry years ago that was in there, but I am not aware of what they were at the time. I know I've also done work with Wild Fish Conservancy. So we've also done some eDNA, environmental DNA samples of water. And with that water, you can filter it out and you can see what type of species of fish there are. What we were actually looking for was Oncorhynchus species, which is any of our salmonids. And we were also looking for sculpins, and we had a positive sample for eDNA in West Beach Creek. So there used to be cutthroat trout in there. And now that the culverts are open, hopefully that is great to hear that friends are seeing some fry coming back or moving down. I certainly think it's important to keep studying these creeks, because I think honestly there's probably a lot more that we just don't know because we're not monitoring them. And I would make the assumption that we might have them until we're proven wrong. And that's why I think it's really important not to stock these creeks or to do things with the assumption that they're not there, because they really might be there. And last thing we want to do is create a situation that's more harmful for them.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
I used to live in Chicago, and they brought coho salmon to feed into Lake Michigan, which is all freshwater.
Yes.
How does that happen if they're by water fish? So how do they survive in all fresh water?
And I don't know about that system, but salmonids have different life histories. And so our anadromous sockeye salmon are the same as our kokanee. The only difference is that the kokanee are landlocked. So they will stay in a lake system. And we have some kind of introduced kokanee in our Cascade Lake area. And they will never make their way out to the ocean, but they can still come back and reproduce in the stream. And then they will live their whole life cycle in the lake. And they're a lot smaller because they don't go to the ocean, but they're going to look just like them. So if you go, I'm not as aware of the kokanee run in the park, but I know in the fall around Thanksgiving, if you go and look, you'll probably see a lot of the kokanee coming back in the creek, just right there by the general parking area at Cascade Lake. And you'll see a lot of little smaller kokanees coming back to spawn. So I imagine coho are the same. They're landlocked, but they can live out their entire life in that lake system or in the creeks.
Okay, that's probably what they did.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't see any other questions. So if that, I'll probably go back to my other job, put my other hat on, get out there and help people at the front desk at the library. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye-bye.
Yeah, and I work at the library. If anybody has any questions or knows anything more about some of the fish species here that are old stories of people on the island that, you know, did stuff with coho salmon, or please just let me know. I'm here at the library, okay?
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, guys.
I put leave down.